great to have you, Furkhan, on the podcast. And we don't have to talk about this, but I was just having a little laugh as we were about to hit record about my my series of events today and being a bit late for the recording and having driven all day and given myself enough time only to be foiled by the unforeseen events of life. And so I don't want to put on any false persona here, because I think that you and I are kind of like that. We're a bit aligned around trying to go into these kinds of conversations and facilitate them. And so whether that comes up or not, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for being for flashing me that smile and comforting me. But you're the host of this cool podcast called Easy Conversations, and maybe we could kind of jump in and maybe just tell my listeners a bit about what that's about and what inspired you to create the podcast.
Yeah, sure. Mitchell, first of all, thank you for having me. And, it is ironic. Things don't always work out the way they're supposed to. And that's kind of been my journey. It's a great theme to start. And it feeds into what inspired me to do the podcast. I had this, vision in life where it was like, okay, get educated, get a job, get married, have a family, and was living that dream, and then all of it kind of like changed. And I went through a divorce and had limited time with my son, and that allowed me to do a lot of work internally. But then I started talking to other men and having deep conversations about purpose in life and what inspires us, and like how are we making a difference in this world. And I really had very open and vulnerable conversations with friends or people I would meet, and we'd be out for coffee or out at a pub, and I realized that a lot of people can get a lot of value from these conversations, because it's relatable, and you're normalizing a lot of these discussions as men we avoid, or don't like to show that vulnerable side about ourselves. And that really kind of springboarded the whole podcast idea. And then I used the play on words. My business name is Zen, so I'll kind of use that, and the whole concept of easy conversations, because I want to change that stigma and shift our mindset that these conversations are only hard because we've created that in our head, right? And we can make them easy. And it's funny, like I've been studying for school right now about exposure therapy, and that's the whole concept of exposure therapy is you expose yourself to that fear, only to realize it's not as bad as you thought. And that's the whole idea with the podcast, is having different men come on, and occasionally women as well, but talking about mental health, talking about serious issues that people have gone through and been able to, with strength and courage, be able to battle and overcome adversity. And my hope is that when other people are listening, they're like, hey, I'm not alone in this struggle. And there's this other person who went through something similar. And all I need to do is maybe ask for help, or talk about it openly. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm getting the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that you described having a kind of initial vision for your life, get a job, have a family, and then it sounds like at some point this space opened up and there was this kind of shift where having conversations about being a man or among men,
Hmm.
like you said, it became important. And that's different, I guess, for everyone, geographically, culturally. you know I think that I'm a little unique in some ways, that I went to an arts high school, and so already when we were like 13, 14, 15, we were massaging, each other's feet. We were doing plays together as young
Hmm.
boys, but that isn't everyone's experience. And no, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, because I just got a sense from the way that you described it that culturally and familially and just sort of ancestrally, there was something there, a kind of shift of like, oh,
Hmm.
like I have to do something about normalizing, conversations among men. And am I picking up on that a little bit, or?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Canada, but my parents are from Pakistan, so they have the whole Eastern culture. And I mean, in our culture, and I think it's kind of the same across the board, but especially in the East Indian culture, men really don't talk about their feelings at all. And that's kind of how I was raised, just growing up. Even if I cried, I was asked, "Why are you crying? Why? It's not a big deal," or "Stop crying," and stuff like that. And it really, I struggled with expressing myself or being able to talk about feelings because I didn't know how. It wasn't modeled for me. And then in itself, I also didn't have this confidence in myself to be able to make choices that I truly believed in. So it was almost like, okay, well, this is kind of the defined path for me of getting married and having a family because that's the ultimate goal. And even within that, when I was married and not really happy and struggling, I kept trying to make it work because I'm like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And until I didn't really get out of it, and recognize the work I needed to do on myself, I didn't value the importance of getting men to talk because for me, looking back at my experience, I realized I struggled with it so much. And I'm sure there's other men who also are in similar situations, whether it's marital problems or job security or other kinds of stresses that we experience in life. So, how can I create a platform or give others that shared space of being able to express these things or talk about it, or ask for help? And, I think if collectively we can all try to do that, we can make a huge difference. But for me, the focus was like on what can I do? And it was that whole series of events from childhood that led me to this place where I was truly passionate about it because I recognized the impact it had in my life.
A lot of people feel that. No, a lot of people, it seems like with every generation and the ways that each generation in a family or a society experience, themselves, or of course what we're going through now with this attempt, at least in most sort of Western countries, to kind of normalize difference. I came today from a city in Sweden called Gothenburg, and every bus actually had two rainbow flags, like jetting out
Mhm.
of the front of it, and there were three big ones in the heart of the city. And I don't even think it was related to anything special going on. It just felt like some kind of symbol, like you're welcome here or something like this. And it must be very jarring. Like I work in Sweden, where there's a huge expat population,
Mhm.
and there's a genuine sense of disorientation. People come here on a work contract from Pakistan, for instance,
Mhm.
from a small village in Pakistan, right to
Yeah.
Stockholm for work for Ericsson or some tech company or something. And even when someone sits with me and talks about this incredible anxiety of being in a place where they can't act instinctively, right? They have to, without any judgment. I actually have a lot of empathy for what it means to go from place to place.
Mhm.
Um, and so I just find all that interesting. I find what you're saying, interesting. And I didn't want to suggest earlier that because I ended up at an arts high school that things were all rosy growing up. It
Mhm.
certainly helped facilitate things a bit earlier because we were into plays and having to go into our emotions. And so I love what you're talking about. And it certainly seems really important. And I hear you kind of saying that to have that mirrored back by others, or to hear people openly talk about it, or going into talking about exposure therapy, something about that mirroring, mediating process just helps us, well, it just, I think, helps with that real violence, I guess,
Hmm.
of the changing personality. And I wanted to ask if it's okay. I wanted just to ask how that was for you, since we're talking about men and with your own dad, if you don't mind talking
Yeah,
about
no,
that. What was that
absolutely.
like for you with your own father? Did he notice these shifts in you?
Sure.
Why don't we go off of video then? I mean, well, let's keep going. I mean, I
Yeah.
just checked my internet. It seems fine. I don't know what that was.
Yeah, I think, yeah, let's keep going. Things look fine now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can edit that out, of course.
Sure.
I'll ask the question again, and then I can
Yeah.
choose either my previous question or the new one. Um, but if you don't mind, sort of, since we are talking about talking with men, or
Hmm.
normalizing, especially from certain cultures where there really is it is a huge stretch, and that isn't the same for everybody, at least in a
Hmm.
certain way of talking about talking. um
Hmm.
how was that with your own dad, and did he notice the shifts in you as you focused on this? Has he commented on it?
He hasn't commented on it. I mean, my dad himself, like again, he grew up in that culture, so he only knows what he grew up with. And, my grandfather, his dad passed away when my dad was fairly young, like only at the age of 19. So, I think for him also, he didn't have that role model for himself. So, he struggles with that stuff. But for me, when I was going for therapy, I recognized a lot of my childhood stuff that I'd buried, um, came from both parents, especially with my dad. And, it took a lot of courage for me at one point. So I noticed, like, there was, like, I'm the eldest child, and there was distance between my dad and I, and we didn't really have a relationship where we spoke about a lot of things. It was fairly superficial. And then I remember going through the motions, like, of getting married and struggling in my marriage, and my dad was really supportive. And then after I went for therapy, I actually sat down with him. I remember I was visiting my parents, and I was feeling very courageous. And then I remember one night we were all sitting, and I was like, Dad, I want to go for coffee with you. There's some important things I need to talk to you about. And my mom and brother were looking at me, and they're like, well, what does he need to talk about? And so my dad's like, sure. And now the next day, I'm up, and I almost have buyer's remorse. I'm like, oh, why did I say anything? Like, now I'm scared. I'm like, how am I going to have this conversation? So my dad's like, hey, I'm free this afternoon. Let's go to a coffee shop and hang out. And I was like, oh, I'm like, are you sure? Like, I'm here for a few more days. He's like, no, no, let's do it today. So fortunately, I went through with it, and it was amazing experience. Like, I sat there with my dad, and I explained all the stuff I've been carrying, and I told him that I've forgiven him. It's not that I I hold that against him, but it's important that I tell him that I've forgiven him so he knows, because I knew he was carrying that too. And it was just an amazing moment in my life where he took full ownership. There's no defensiveness. And since then it's brought us even closer together.
Mhm.
And when I tell my other friends about doing that, they're just like, blown away because they're like, we would never be able to have that conversation with our dad, um, even from a cultural perspective. But yeah, like it was hard my whole life, and we never really connected on that level until recently when I took that leap. And for me, ultimately, the focus became around forgiving my parents and not hanging on to the things they did because they were doing the best they could as parents, but ultimately taking that responsibility and ownership within myself to make a difference and choose to do different in my own life. And then also having that grace and compassion for my parents.
It's so interesting. Uh, I mentioned to you that on my drive home today, I listened to a whole bunch of interviews, and
Mm-hmm.
there really did seem to be this theme running through a number of them, which was the unavoidability of these of this friction. You know that
Mm-hmm.
that there can, I think, sometimes be a misconstrued notion in mental health, or even talking about, for instance, attachment. You know, if we start from the place of, well, okay, if there was a failure to talk about stuff, then ideally the perfect parent, quote unquote, would bring the child into the world and anticipate their mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
create a safe emotional environment. I mean, how many times do you hear people talk about safe attachment these days, right? It's like, say, you know, and that's the bread and butter of what I do to a large extent. On the other hand, I feel like we can get a bit seduced into trying to think that somewhere out there is this kind of ideal family, ideal culture where people anticipate everyone's needs, people always call everyone the way they want to be called, people people never, but the truth is, like you're pointing out, the meaning with your father, like like looking back at your life with him, when you talk to your friends and you reflect it back,
Mm-hmm.
the meaning is in the present tense. The meaning isn't, oh, this failure happened and we rectified it. If anything, the story is our relationship is defined by these differences in generations, in
Mm-hmm.
geography, in culture, and through these accidents of whatever history and momentum,
Mm-hmm.
we now have this kind of treasure trove of kind of meaning as a result of these tensions. And so I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if I'm kind of just going off on a tangent, but I think that there's something to be said, and that's why I laughed earlier about my day today, which was that I just listened to all these lectures about kind of things not going the way you want them to, and then here I'm getting
Mm-hmm.
frustrated they're not going the way I want them to, and I'm kind of laughing at the same time as being like, this is really frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's something about how do we, yeah, how do we normalize this and not subscribe to a hyper potentially capitalist notion that we're all heading towards some kind of perfection and we're just ironing out the wrinkles, versus the
Mm-hmm.
wrinkles are, that is
Yeah.
life. The life is in the
Absolutely.
wrinkles. And
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, in the moment, as you said, like when things aren't working out as you plan, it's frustrating. It's hard to see the meaning behind it. But it's only when you reflect you see the true meaning, right? And for me, I think the reason why this was also important having that conversation with my dad was, maybe doing a part in breaking that generational trauma. So when my son grows up, it's different, and I kind of manifest that in my relationship with my child, where he's also comfortable having these conversations with me, because I'm sure he's going to have a lot of questions about his parents separating and who did what. And I want to create that environment by role modeling it for him, that hey, if you want to have that conversation with me, by all means. And the way he's experienced is obviously different than I have, and I'm sure he's going to have his own questions.
what I don't know, what would you want people to know about the kind of intimate interactions that you have with other men in terms of trying to promote or normalize these dialogues? You've referenced a few times that there are friends who kind of look at some of the openness between you and your own father and are like, I don't know if I could ever do that. You mentioned this idea of exposure of really raising these issues, and I'm just curious what comes to mind, or what's touched you about yeah, what you've put out there in the podcast, and just maybe any memories of kind of moments with other men and talking to them that have stayed with you.
Um, I mean, there's a lot there, but it's just ultimately recognizing that everyone I've spoken to, and when we've gone into those depths, is there's something every man I've spoken to is carrying some form of shame or trauma from childhood or early life, and it's buried so deep that a lot of the guys have struggled to face it, and some of them have done it privately, and for me, I was also doing it very like in private, in isolation, and it was important for me to start talking about it so others can also open up. And that's kind of where, when I have these conversations with other men, they're very open and transparent and vulnerable about that shame they've carried, and it's even with feeling weak, or feeling like they're not good enough, and the shame that comes with it as a man, that I should be able to take care of myself. I should be the strong person that protects everyone else around me and provides for everyone. And until you don't shift your perspective, you don't recognize that real strength is in being able to ask for help, or being able to openly talk about your flaws and the mistakes you've made. And so that's kind of the common theme with the men I talk to, is getting to the root of the shame and being able to talk about it openly. And that's where, again, it comes back to normalizing these conversations. The more we do it, the more you expose yourself to it, the easier it gets.
Yeah, the shame is what it's often acted out in aggression or violence to others or violence to oneself, I guess, right? And
Mhm.
that's really what we're talking about, aren't we? That
Yeah.
in certain cultures, a certain kind of aggression is not just permissible, it's just part of the kind of structure. And I'm not pointing at any one culture here. This
Hmm.
exists in all of our cultures, in all countries. There's
Yeah.
segments of society where I've seen it in my office. I've watched people's bodies. I've seen people get up and just want to run out of the room, or go towards somebody, or notice it in myself in moments, right? It's tough. When people start talking about shame, I notice my own. Sometimes I don't notice it because it's so quiet. Like you said, it's buried so deep.
Hmm.
But other times I'll notice I can't think in those moments when somebody else is in shame. Or, it's funny, haven't thought about this in a while, but when I first started working as a therapist, people would say the word shame and I actually would go blank. And
Hmm.
it was because I really didn't know it in myself until, a good chunk of the way in. And I was like, oh, right, that's why I can't think this, which is so interesting when it comes to emotion. Are you talking about your son, and that we have to be curious? Otherwise, it just comes out in behavior, I guess, is
Yeah.
the prevailing wisdom.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess it does strike at something else that I think is so important right now. And you're living in the U.S. right now, right? You're born in
Canada. Yeah.
Canada.
Yeah. No, I'm living in Canada
Oh,
too.
you're
Yeah.
living in Canada.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you lived in the U.S. before? No.
No,
Okay. Where are you in Canada?
Calgary.
You're in Calgary. Okay. One of the obstacles I think that we're facing is how we collectively deal with shame, particularly male shame,
Hmm.
because there seems to be a swift reaction in our culture right now when particularly men are outed. Uh, I guess we had it with our governor general, right, who was a woman and was right. not
Hmm.
unprecedented, but not in recent memory has a governor general kind of stepped down, and she, right, Payette stepped down because she was the reports of her aggression in the workplace, and so it's not a
Hmm.
gender thing.
No.
Um, but I've been troubled a little bit by our ability to contain and talk about shame without there being just this kind of swift cancellation of people. And there
Yeah.
seems to be a toxic kind of cycle of someone's shamed, canceled, and then marginalized. And I always ask
Hmm.
myself, where does the shame go then? I don't want anyone to be confused. I'm not promoting or advocating that anybody who's behaving in a hurtful, aggressive, or unethical way stays in their role. I'm just wondering, how do we deal with it? How can we include or talk about the kind of toxicity without further marginalizing or alienating
Hmm.
people? Which I guess is part of
Yeah.
what you're doing. We're trying to
Yeah,
do.
I know, and I think it's an important thing you've touched on is the whole cancellation of everything. Is if you're just going to erase something or hide it or tuck it away, how are you going to learn from it? So how are we equipping people to know better so they can do better if we're just hiding all these mistakes? And I think part of it, yeah, the work, at least my goal is to talk about mistakes openly too, because those are part of our life. Um, and I know we were talking offline before, but the whole concept of even self-actualization, right? If you can't get to your best self if you're going to just hide parts of yourself, the parts that don't align with your with the self that you visualize, right? So if I want to be a men's coach and I'm preaching about being vulnerable and doing all these things, and there's certain parts of me that is also making mistakes, and I'm not openly admitting it because of my fear of imposter syndrome, how am I being the best version of myself? And that's I think that's part of the problem, right? It's we get again. It comes back to shame. Like there's this shame from society for making mistakes. It's if you're portraying yourself as someone, you need to be 100% aligned with that vision, and that's not real. That's not realistic.
Yes, right. It's not realistic to be 100% aligned with anything. I guess that's the
Yeah.
right. That's a lovely idea for us to hold together, right? That because I struggle with that. I struggle with the ways that we try and talk about these ideas. And so, for instance, I like the notion of authenticity, but I also think it's problematic because we're never fully authentic.
Hmm.
We're always catching up with ourselves. We're always, it's that's why I guess they call it Jung called it the dynamic unconscious or the dynamic
Hmm.
psyche or this, and I guess that makes me think too about, has your father listened to your podcast, or is he?
No, he hasn't. It's just not his thing, and he's not really a techie. So
When I put it out there, that was a particular vulnerability for me with my family. It was a bit, it felt next level. Like we'd had many conversations, but it felt next level, not just with my family, but with others. There's a kind of, raw exposure there. And I guess I'm bringing that up just to think about the fact that you and I, two men, different cultures, thousands of kilometers away,
mhm.
mediating this conversation through very contemporary technology.
Yeah.
I often think about the role that culture plays in in the evolution of how we relate to ourselves and our emotions. And um, I think that it's been going on for a lot longer. I don't know if I mentioned this in my last podcast or not, but that I'd found this book at my cottage this summer from 1947, and it was an American physician who wrote a book called Psychosomatic Medicine.
Hmm.
And he was talking about how the love between parents was so important for the development of the child.
Yeah.
Child, if if that doesn't exist or the parents don't do something about it, that it'll really affect the development of the child. And I don't mean that in any conservative way. There's many ways that can happen, right? Love can be acknowledging certain things or having to do something about the relationship, or but I was just amazed that we think we're very contemporary. We think we're very actualized, or we're here talking about emotions, but
Yeah.
um, it seems to me that this has been going on for a long time, and we almost have to reinvent it for ourselves, each of us in our own lives, in our own way.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like some of the stuff I've been reading is from the 1920s or, you know, 1930s.
what were
And,
you reading?
these,
What do you been?
well, so there's this poet, he was Pakistani actually. His name's Allama Iqbal, and he talks about the whole concept of self. And he takes a whole religious spin on it. But he basically talks about, it, grow yourself to the point where even God asks you, like, are you doing the right things, right? Like, so it's like you need to be able to. It starts with a pure heart and finding love for yourself, where you can create that higher self within you. That there's no distinction between you and God. So it's pretty deep, but yeah,
What's
just
his last
reading
name
that.
again, just so people can
Uh,
hear it clearly?
Iqbal, so
Iqbal.
Iqbal, yeah. But very profound stuff. And I just recently, started thinking about it because I knew about his poetry, but really getting into the depths of it and what it means, and I've found it quite fascinating.
Did I hear you right that you grow yourself to the point, and correct me here, where you almost
Yeah,
confuse God? Like God is now asking you, like there's almost no
yeah. So
distinction there, or
you're getting to that higher self that, you know, and at least this is my interpretation. I'm sure there's different interpretations of it, and I don't want to offend anyone, but for me, the way I interpret it is you're getting yourself to this higher self where you're basically there's no distinction between you and God. Like obviously God's created all beings, but you're also at a higher self. You're doing all that work internally.
and then you said even where God is asking you what you're doing.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that? What does that mean for you? I find that idea so interesting.
I think it's basically you're for me what it means is, are you happy with the choices you're making? Basically, we're all individuals who make choices in life. And deep down, the whole concept of self, deep down, we know the impurities we have in our lives. So if we can consciously make these choices knowing that we're doing our best, that's to me, you've gotten to that higher self, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not the same thing, but for some reason in my mind as you talk about it, there's this idea in therapy where the patient becomes a therapist, and there's
Mm-hmm.
this sort of like it dissolves in some ways, like you don't
Yeah.
know, the hierarchy is gone, and I think there's an attitude that one can bring from the beginning of therapy, which at least works against the hierarchy to the best of one's ability, right? That's something we can sort of consciously intend as a therapist or even as a patient, right? To come in and
Mm-hmm.
be aware that there's a kind of horizontality there. But again, referencing a lot of what I listened to today, there's a kind of giving over, I guess, to our imperfection, right? There's a giving
Mm-hmm.
over to, I want to say, not being in control, but that sounds like a well-worn path, right? That
Yeah.
people often talk about that, right? To give up control. But there's something I think about a deep acceptance of, as you were pointing out, it's our impurity and our faults is at the basis of what means that we're alive and we're human.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something freeing about that, I think. Something freeing. I think I even felt it in my body earlier today, unrelated to before we met, about
Mm-hmm.
just kind of watching life or holding life a little bit more, gently in terms of the ways that things evolve in our life. And
Yeah, no, I think for me, when I start thinking about it, is being able to accept everything, right? And when you mentioned flaws, that is part of life, that we are flawed, and that's the beauty of it. And we can hide those parts of ourselves and not be whole, or we can accept it all and recognize that, you know, life is a continuous journey of making mistakes and learning from them and continuing to grow from them. And giving that space and compassion to everyone, including yourself.
yeah, yeah, it's always there's something trembling about it. I find that it is these plateaus in life, and I never know what the next sort of challenge to that sense of understanding is going to be. But it's
Yeah.
and that's what I was listening to today, that I think they were saying that Hegel was really pointing to, is that this is not about eradicating violence.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that even Zizek talks about. Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, will say that, even these very violent eruptions in our um, politics, whether it's the withdrawal recently from Afghanistan, whether it's the Black Lives Matters movement, these are part and parcel of the evolutions, or our own personal versions of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Relationships that we struggle with, or workplace. But I guess when we're in it, that's the thing, right? When we're in it, we don't have that sense of perspective. That's the whole point, right? Wholeness is not, oh, I know I'm whole.
Mm-hmm.
Wholeness is an attitude, right? Wholeness is an intention. It's just like, I'm going to try to maintain some sense of curiosity, which I know I talk about a lot on this podcast, but it's
Mm-hmm.
I think when we're in it, if we're really in it, we don't know if we're going to come out the other side. And that's something I like to think about, because I think our language can get a bit flowery, like
Mm-hmm.
the rising from the ashes, or this implicit
Mm-hmm.
Christian narrative that, oh, if you go through this, you'll come out the other side and you'll be better. And it's like, well, I don't, when we're in it, we don't know that. So we also have to entertain the opposite of that, that it's like, I don't know if I will actually, or if this will mean
Mm-hmm.
anything. That's, I
Yeah.
guess, part of you know, anything else that you'd want folks to know about your podcast, where they can find you before we pause? Because I suspect I'd love to connect again. It's a
Yeah.
nice connection for me. I feel a nice, yeah. I get why people would come to you and feel safe, and that you'd be helping a lot of people to at least sort of prime the pump, if you will, of conversations. And
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's the goal. And I appreciate, again, you giving me the opportunity to come on here and have this conversation with you. Yeah, I mean, if people want to check out the podcast, we talked about it. It's easy. So EZ Conversations. It's on pretty much every platform. And then I'm also on Instagram at Unoiazen. So EUNOIAZEN. Those are the two ways to find me or get a hold of me. I love engaging with people, having conversations like this. And yeah,
cool, we should do something on Instagram together. That'd be
yeah,
fun.
yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
I've been really liking that engagement there. It's nice to talk to people, and cool. Well, thank you for making the time today, and yeah, it's good to look at you and kind of feel all the feels and talk about this.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mitchell. I appreciate it.